Thank you for joining us for the Climate Justice Working Group meeting today, February 9th, 2023. I know everybody's very busy, probably hungry because I did schedule this at lunch. Apologies in advance, but I know everybody's super busy, so we'll get started right away. Just for folks who are attending as and listening in, I just want to look and people that this is sorry, next slide, please. Just reminding folks, this is a meeting of the Climate Justice Working Group. It is not a public hearing or a public forum. We're not going to be taking any testimony or questions from the public during this meeting. If you have any questions or comments on the proceedings, you can send them to our Climate Justice Working Group email address. It's climatejusticewg@dec.ny.gov. For working group members, you know the traditional procedures. We'd like the rooms to be muted just to reduce noise. If you're not talking, please keep your and you're participating virtually, please stay on mute. Please raise your hand to indicate if you would like to speak. And just for the sake of the transcripts, just in case folks want to read them, try to say your names before speaking, just so we know who's talking if we have to go back and look at notes. Okay, next slide. All right, I know that I'm pretty sure we don't have quorum, but we'll still do a roll call so we know who's here right now. And just for note-taking purposes, we have myself, Alana Cadell-Tucky, here in Albany.
And Chris Cole from NYSERDA.
Okay, who do we have in New York City?
Elizabeth Firth from Labor.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I see, I'm going to go by who I see now on my screen. I see Abby in Region 8. Hi, Abby.
Hey, everybody.
I see Jill in our Rayburg office. Hi, Jill.
Hi, everybody.
I know that Mary Beth is going to be joining us a little bit later. She'll be in our Utica office. And I don't believe Rawa has gotten here yet. But when she gets here, we'll make sure to add her. And I know that Neil Muscatelio is from the Department of Health is on his way. Let's see who we have virtually. I see Eddie.
Hola.
Hi, Eddie. Let's see. Oh, Sonal. Sonal's online. Hi, Sonal.
Hi, I'm here.
And I think that is it for working group members. We are also joined by DEC technical staff, and we have our contractors, Illume, it's Loom Advising, right? Thanks, I think Loom Advising. We have Alex Dunn.
Hello, everyone.
And we have Shannon. Right, Shannon on? I thought I saw her name.
Hi.
Yes, I have to scroll up and down here. I just say that I saw you. And we, as always, we have Emma from our DEC Office of Communication Services on the back end. So if there are any technical issues, you can definitely reach out to Emma and she will help to solve them. So we'll get started with our meeting. Next slide, please. So here's our agenda. We're just going to dive right into the methodological review and the Tableau workshop. We're going to, at the end, just do a quick timeline review. And I want folks to, while we're just going through our regular climate justice working group work, while we're listening, while we're absorbing everything that Alex and Shannon will be presenting to us, I just want folks to take a moment to think about the tentative voting date, which at this point is February 23rd. And I would like for everyone to kind of consider whether it's still feasible, without given all the information and all that we have left to do, if that date is still feasible, or if we want to consider pushing that date to a date in March, just to make sure we're giving all of this the appropriate weight. Neil Muscatelio just joined us. Hi, Neil.
Hey.
So we'll talk about this at the end of our meeting, but I just wanted to sort of mention that here at the beginning, so it's in the back of everybody's mind as we're moving forward. Next slide, please. And we'll just jump right in with Alex. Thanks.
Okay, I am going to share my screen now and gonna share the whole screen because we got a lot to show. So I'm gonna kind of jump back into here and talk about methodology. Last time we spoke, there were 4 areas that we had discussed, look into and try to get some answers for the meeting so that you all can take a look and then discuss. At this point, I can show you what we've done, and I'm happy to kind of show you and have you poke around with the maps. I'm not sure with the, and feel free to ask questions and take a look, but we can't make any decisions today if we don't have quorum. So what I'll do is present the maps, show you the different scenarios that we've been talking through. And then what I can do is also package up the Tableau maps for you all, and then you can take a look at them. And then the next time we meet, we can make some decisions based on this. So the 4 items I really want to talk about today, particularly the review right at the bottom, review inclusion of higher income communities. This is something we should be checking every single time. I kept it down there because I think it's important. But we're going to go through 3 different types of scenarios based on the comments that we're responding to and the discussion from those comments last meeting. The first one is to review whether the group wants to continue to stick with a 35% DAC designation for the geographic ones. Then we're going to look at the kind of, this is all to the point of trying to weight things more than other things. So multiplying component scores, those are the big burden score and the big vulnerability score. If we multiply them, it means that we can't really weight, say, the vulnerability component more than the burden score. So if we look at adding those component scores rather than multiplying them, then we can start doing some weighting. So we're going to look at that. And then we're going to look at weighting factors and indicators that represent resiliency and representation of Black and Latino groups as well. So any questions before I jump in? Okay. Can't see all you, and I can't see the chat, so please just speak up. Okay, so I hear someone. Did someone want to say something?
just me, Alex, Dr. Dunn. It's Eddie. As usual, I'm trying my best to follow. So I'm sure the succeeding slides will clarify. Thank you.
Yeah, and also I think, so speak up because like some of these are like the whole, and I think it's hilarious because I've done this multiple times where when I start thinking about the multiply and add one, it like really messes with your brain. So just know that it's a thing and it's not easy. So we will go through it over and over again, and I have to remind myself. The first one we want to talk about, and Sonal, this is something that you brought up, and I think it's a really important one to kind of think about and talk through, is the 35% designation versus, say, if we chose to do it 25%, so a quarter of the census tracts designated as DACs. And here's the comparison that you can look at here. I pulled out the differences, so this would be if you went with 25%, then there would be 14% less census tracts designated a DAC in New York City. And so this is kind of the breakdown that we see. And over here I have the numbers. Overall, there would be 514 fewer DACs being designated, census tracts being designated a DAC. Most of those, over half, would come from New York City. Yep.
It's Jill. Can you please make it a little bigger?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Is that good?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Alex, I'm so sorry. I'm fuzzy on the 35 versus 25. Could you just flesh out what the precise question is and why those 2 numbers? I'm sorry, just
Yeah.
a little update.
On that, so originally what we had decided as a group when we voted on the draft criteria was how big of a piece of a pie of the New York census tracts do we want to designate as a DAC? And that we had kind of a lot of discussion of leave no DACs behind and what would we end up with. And so in in the discussion before we voted on the draft criteria, there was a lot of discussion about, well, expanding the designation so that there would be 35% of those census tracts could be designated a DAC. And let me show you what this would look like as a map. So that you're actually seeing the same things here. You're seeing the same kind of counts and percentages. And let me make this bigger. Okay, so in this case, what you're seeing here is all the yellows would be the census tracts that would not be designated a DAC if you chose to go with a smaller piece of the pie. So like so much of what we're doing at this point, there's not a lot of science or knowledge about what's best at this point. There's a lot of choices that we have to make based on the policies that you want to implement. And so this is very much one of those. This is okay, we have done the best to include all the indicators we think. We have done all the adding up the way that we want. We're happy with all of that. But then now how much of New York State do we designate as a DAC? And so the proportions that we had talked to with when we had originally done this was 35% versus say 25% or more. If you leave out certain groups if you make the piece of the pie smaller, then what you'll see in certain regions, okay, come on, you can do this. Woo. Okay, let me zoom out a little bit and then go here. If you look into Rochester, what you'll see is the red. Those are the ones that would be included, irrespective of whether it was a 25% piece of the pie versus the 35%. But the yellow are those that are included only when you expand the designation to 35% of all census tracts in New York State.
Alex, thank you for zooming in on Rochester. This is Abby. I have a quick question. At a quick glance, it looks to me like what we're losing is primarily rural communities. Is that correct, incorrect?
Not necessarily. Let me go back to,
Like, yeah, especially kind
Yeah.
of the broader map when you were further out, I think.
yeah, you definitely lose some of the critical ones, and especially I would say that if you're losing 5% of say some of the rural areas, or say 9% of the southern tier, you're going to be losing quite a lot, right? Proportionally speaking, you're losing half of the DACs that were designated. Overall, though, the biggest loser would be New York City, insofar as they're losing 286 DACs. Over half of the ones that get lost are in New York City. So it's really kind of a proportions game. It looks in the map because rural DACs are larger visually, and so you see them a lot more. But if I zoom into New York City, you'll see a lot of yellow in there as well. And so there are quite a lot that get lost as well. I do want to note, though, that this is, one of the things that I think is important to think through also is if you choose to do, say, 25%, you still have the individual criteria to overlay on top of that. And that would add, say, about 15% of households on top of that. So it limits the geographic area, but it still allows you to have, and maintain a larger proportion of New York State. I saw a comment, but I can't see comments, so anyone able to?
Actually, I raised my hand, but I don't know if anyone else was ahead of me, so I'll wait.
This is Sonal. I had my hand up too, but Eddie, you can go and I'll go after you.
Thanks, Sonal. I'm looking at this slide. Just a question and I guess an observation. The slide we're looking at right now, Alex, that's the 35% as opposed to 25%. Is that correct?
Wait, are you looking at it? I'm showing a map, right? Everyone can see a map.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the 35% is the red. Or sorry, the 35% is the red and yellow combined. And then the 25% is only the red. So if you see something that's yellow, that would be only designated a DAC if you chose to cover a wider swath of census tracts in New York State.
I see. Oh, no, great. Thank you. That really helps. Yeah. I just think an observation that what worries me a little bit is that it looks like if I'm following you, yeah, the yellow, for example, I'm looking at the yellow in Brooklyn, looks like we may be leaving out parts of central Brooklyn, which would be problematic. But no, thank you. I'll go ahead, so I'll keep looking. Sorry.
Yeah, you asked my question, Eddie, so I'm good. But yeah, my reaction is that it's not like this is not looking, at least for me, like the right solution, just based on what I'm seeing here and like what's getting lost in the other regions, like what Abby was asking about.
Well, and because we don't have quorum, what I'd want to do is rediscuss everything again and make decisions specifically about this next time. But I think, this exact kind of discussion is what we had discussed last time. And I think it's a little bit striking sometimes when you see the yellow in here, which is everything you'd lose if you were, if you were taking out 10% of the census tracts, right? So you're definitely making a choice to make that piece of the pie smaller. And I think that this is, again, one of those things that is very much a judgment call on the working group's part of how much do you want to cover and how much do you want to focus the funding or not. So that's the discussion I think next time that we'll have. But I did want to show you the map, and I will package this up so that you can tinker with it, and you'll take a look at the different breakdowns of it. But it's a useful map, I think, into visualizing what you would lose. On the flip side, you would be able to gain, say, a little bit more focus. Yeah, here, Eddie, let me zoom back into New York City. I saw that pop up.
This is Abby. Can I also ask a question of Chris? Chris, from your perspective, what would this mean in terms of kind of program implementation?
So I think if we're talking about, shifting kind of what is designated a disadvantaged community, I think the implications are really going to be based on like program design, right? So there'll be state programs and investments that are going to be made that, are going to be intended to, be supporting kind of the whole state. And then there's going to be programs and investments that are going to have to be designed and tailored to meet the needs and overcome the barriers that, underserved communities are facing. So it's hard to say kind of, just kind of looking at the distribution of the DACs, what that means. So it's really going to be, important that as investments and programs are kind of designed, that there's thought about, how those are kind of accessible and benefiting these communities. I don't know, is that helpful, Abby? I know it's not like a straightforward answer, but I think that's the best that.
Let me ask it a slightly different way.
Yeah.
Chris, are you leaning one way or the other on this?
So I think when it comes to, I mean, there's two things that are on my mind when it comes to like the how much of the state is being covered by disadvantaged communities. Oh, we can't get into this deliberation. Oh, we can't deliberate.
Oh, okay. Never mind then.
Sorry.
Look forward to deliberating with you a different day.
Yeah. Apologies, everybody. The line between deliberation and,
We just need two more people
Discussions.
to show up in person and then ask away.
yeah.
I know it gets so tricky. So I'll continue showing you all these different scenarios and things, and then we can kind of, deliberate on them specifically at another time. Oh, come on.
Hey, Alex, we actually have a question in the chat from the New York City office. It says, what's the total percentage of the state population captured with the 35% to the 25% change?
let me see. I had some old slides teed up to look at this. And it's a little tricky because trying to do all the math is not necessarily gonna work. For the 35% scenario, you'd cover 2,540,000. If you added individual criteria to that, then you get up to 3,586,000. That's with the 35% scenario. And I don't have the numbers necessarily to show you the comparison for the 25%. But I did want to show you this, which is the individual criteria would add another 14%. A lot of this discussion has arisen because when you add the individual criteria on, you're adding quite a lot of, the proportion of New York State in population. And because of that, you're getting up to upwards of 45% of the New York State population.
Alex, can you remind me how many, and maybe it's in this chart and I'm just not reading it very well, but what is the state population of DACs without the individual criteria again?
Let me go back to the previous one because I think this is what it's got. This is a while back, so this is 2 million. So this is the 35% scenario. These are households and so you've got 2,540,000.
Alex, you may have just said this, but I need you to say it in a different way. If there were a no low income household scenario, or no low income household left behind scenario, that's what I meant to say, what would it be?
If you chose the 35% scenario and you chose to add in individual, or as we did in the draft criteria, you have the individual households that are low income. So that means the 60% AMI, correct me if I'm saying that wrong. And in that case, you have 3,586,208 households that are covered. Some of these numbers may have changed with census now being updated, and this is an old one. And for the next one, how about I go and I get all those numbers for the 25% versus the 35%, but it's still going to be a little bit of wiggle room and error because we're actually estimating this based on, what is it? 200 FPL as opposed to others, so that we're trying to estimate to the 60% AMI. Any other questions or thoughts here?
Hey, Alex, yeah, it's Eddie again. I just dropped a question in the chat, and I'm still at the moment where I'm not sure if I'm even asking the right question anymore. But you to follow up on Abby's question, so using the 25%, would the numbers be higher?
No, the 25% would be you'd start with lower numbers here, and then you would add in, say, this would probably be a little bit higher. So it would be a wash. I bet you it would be around 3 million households or a little less, but not a huge amount less. It's a balancing act, right? You start restricting the amount of DACs, you still have a lot of low income people that are not then going to be covered. They would then be covered in the individual criteria. It gets really tricky really fast on this because if you start looking at these census tracts and what you would lose if you went to the 25% scenario, a lot of people living in these census tracts would still be covered if you had the individual criteria. But, and this is a big but here, the spirit of the law had been to geographically target communities, and the individual criteria doesn't do that. So you have to balance what you wanted to do with the law and how we interpret the law, how you as a working group interpret the law. Did I just make everything harder?
No, I don't think so. This is Abby again, sorry. But let me again kind of like restate what I think I heard, and you can tell me if I got it right or wrong. So if we're looking for kind of community level investment, if we are limiting the number of census tracts, we won't necessarily lose low income households and be able to kind of serve low income households, but community level projects may be lost.
Or they might be harder to implement. And that's something that, you know, we could kind of talk about a little bit more. But say you're working in a neighborhood and you're trying to work through certain areas that, you know, are highly impacted. If you are working in this area, so this would be Queens, and this yellow part would, if in the 25% deck, would not be geographically included, but there would be many households within that that would be included. How would you implement the programs? That's not necessarily something we have to worry about, but I wanted to bring it up as something to think about. And you all have mentioned it last year as well.
Hey, Alex, it's Chris at Albany. I guess the one thing also to kind of add here is, when we're thinking about what portion of the state the DAC criteria covers, the other thing I want to just, make sure we're thinking about is investments is one part of it, but also kind of like the rulemaking and the regulatory kind of impacts that or need to be applied to DACs also are, should be considered here, right? So, so if we limit the number of communities, then potentially there's, fewer communities that can be, covered in that rulemaking consideration and vice versa. So.
Like zoning practices, are you talking about, Chris? Things like that, or zoning rules?
Yeah, I mean,
Or in section 7.3 of the Climate Act, it would limit our administrative actions being that are not allowed to disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. And that they could potentially limit that. So it's not just for benefits and investments, it's other aspects of the CLCPA as well.
Mm-hmm. And like I said when I started out, what we're talking about today, I'll show you data and I'll give you, my thoughts on various parts when I have them. But so much of this is a judgment call about what you want to accomplish. And if it's, designating a larger proportion so that you can have the different aspects of these regions be designated a DAC, then that is a very viable and worthwhile choice. It's equally, if you want to have a different perspective as far as limiting and targeting the funding a little bit more, then it's equally okay to choose the 25% or some proportion between 35 and 25. I think all of those are, viable options. We're getting to the place now where these are judgment calls as a working group that you all have to make. Not today, but when we have a quorum, then we can kind of get some direction. So I'll review this again. I also will export this map in particular so that you can tinker with it. And I'll make it easier so that you can actually change the percentage. And I'll give a little tutorial on how to do that next time, as far as so that you can tinker with how it looks and make this 30%. Anyone want to see the 30% option? No?
Yeah,
Yeah, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Eddie.
I'd like to see it. If you could
Okay.
do the 30%, but then Eddie, yeah, go ahead.
Sure. I guess and I hear you, Alex. I mean, this was always going to get to this kind of dicey part where it's just judgment calls as opposed to like clear, objective, guideposts for us. So, I just based on what you said, I just wanted to see if I could reflect back something for us to consider that might help remove a little bit of the subjectivity and try to make it a little more objective. I know, and thank you for pointing it out. Like, not only is it in the text, but it was the clear intent by at least the advocates and some of the bill's sponsors that when this component of CLCP was being discussed, the idea was to drive as much investment communally, right? To uplift and direct both protective, environmental protection initiatives to DAX, as well as to drive investments to make up for the historical disparities, right? So, given that, if we wanted to cleave closer to the intent of the law, which was to try to, again, leave no DAC behind kind of thing, given that, like if we wanted to err on that side, what would you think would be what option would get us the higher number? I think I know this, but I'm just trying to contextualize this question in the context of the CLCPA, which you mentioned earlier, which I think could be a really helpful way for us to be thinking about this.
Yeah, and I think this was kind of where everyone landed last time, based on this very conversation, and the choice of 35% was that middle ground where people felt like, okay, we're leaving no DAC behind, but we're still including individual households, and it does make things higher, but it allows for some community perspective and that, or community targeting, and that was where people landed last time. But I think it's always worth looking at these again, and with open eyes recognize that these are decisions that we're making as a working group, you're all making, but there are also things that are not. I will say this, that in the next couple years, as this is implemented, you will know a lot more about the effectiveness of, say, the geographic targeting and within communities versus the individual ones. Because we haven't enacted anything yet, it's really hard to know the effectiveness of it. And so that's what I think, taking the long view of saying, okay, we're going to do the best now and then continue on and see how things are performing, that will help a lot. My own opinion on that. Okay, let me try to get 30% here. So 7, 8, let's try that. See if I can manage it. Bear with me, this is clunky now. We have a lot of data behind this point. So I might have to tinker with this a little bit more. Oh, getting close, okay. So just so you guys see what I'm doing, these are different inputs that I can make, and because we have this, statewide versus rest of, New York City only versus rest of the state breakdown, we have to kind of tinker with the numbers here to make it so that what I'm looking at right here is this 35% versus this 29%, trying to get that 29% to be 30%. This is how the sausage is made. Okay, so now we can go back to the map and you can see what it looks like. I always have to take a deep breath and hope that things don't crash when I do all this. Okay, I am going to look at this one because this one has our table. Okay. Okay, this will get us there. So now if we've done 30% versus 35%, you can start seeing that clearly there's 5% more, so there's fewer yellow visual bits here because those would be would still be included. So if we look at that same place in Queens where at the 25%, these, I think 4 different census tracts would have been dropped with the 25% piece of the pie. When you increase it to 30, they are back in. Let's look at the rest of the state. So again, less visual yellow, but you're still excluding, 5% fewer census tracts in the scenario where you're giving just that 30%. Any region you all want me to go look at? Okay, we started in Rochester, so I'm going to go to Rochester. So last time, I think some of these census tracts were also yellow. Now they're back in. Okay. Any other thoughts or questions about the piece of the pie discussion part?
Hey, Alex, this is Neil. I have a quick question, and sort of for everybody, but I'm just wondering if it would be helpful. Is there a way you can sort of look at, those excluded if we're using 25 versus 30 versus 35 according to like their vulnerability and their burden scores, like some of those measures to I'm just trying to sort of understand who
You're missing?
what we're excluding by those different criteria. I'm wondering if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think I
Give us
can.
more information that might make it more difficult to make a decision, but I think for me, it would be useful to see sort of like, do we really see a difference in, for example, the burden percentile or the vulnerability percentile? Or is there, there's likely a distribution, right? And they probably overlap, but it'd be interesting to see if there is some, more separation. That was just a thought that might sort of help me.
Yeah, and I can give those numbers. I would have to summarize those like in mass if we were going to do that, and I can do that for the next one. But we can do kind of an ad hoc comparison here, and you can look at, okay, well, this would be included if it were 35% designated. The burden percentile is 82nd percentile. Vulnerability would be 33rd percentile. Right next to it would be included no matter what. And in this case, you've got 58th percentile in the burden, but vulnerability is up to 72%, 72nd percentile. You look up here, this would be excluded. The vulnerability is lower than those that are included if you see them here. Let's find another neighboring one because I find those useful. This stack, only in the 35% scenario would it be included. It has a very low burden percentile, but a very high vulnerability percentile. And then if I go down, this one is a very high vulnerability percentile, but then slightly higher than the one that would be excluded in the burden percentile. So it's kind of like you're just moving the threshold around a little bit and it's changing the math a little bit. Let me jump out and go to New York City so we can do some of these comparisons in New York City.
Alex,
Hey,
what?
this
Oh,
is
go ahead. I'm sorry.
sorry. This is Elizabeth in New York. The question of the Hamptons versus, not versus, but also the native land that overlaps it. Can we look at that?
Over in Long Island, are you talking about?
Yeah, like outer
Let me
Southampton.
come back.
Southampton.
Yeah. So remember that one thing this map does not show you, as beautiful and amazing as they are, that all native lands that are census tracts that are considered within native lands are added after the fact.
Right,
No matter
so
what.
it would make sense if we were limiting it, so then we kick out the Hamptons, but we're still including them.
That looks like West Hampton. I think the other side of that bay to the east of it should be Shinnecock. Nope, can you scroll over to the east side? more
Oh,
towards
okay.
Montauk?
Yeah,
So
further
to the
out.
east,
Sorry.
Oh, other
east
way.
side over there.
The other
There we go.
east.
The other east.
I just want to jump in
Okay.
quickly. Mary Beth is here. If we could just see in Utica, that means we do have a quorum.
Woohoo!
Cool. Yay.
Great.
Okay, so,
So that's in both scenarios then, yeah.
It is in both
Okay.
scenarios.
okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Mary Beth, I just need you to quick say that you're here. So hear what she said.
Hi
Sorry,
there.
Lon-
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said. Hi, good afternoon.
Hi. Okay, yep, we have a quorum, so we may now deliberate.
Hey,
Okay.
it's Eddie. I'm sorry, quick question. I'm just looking for a little clarity. Earlier when we started talking about um, vulnerability versus burdens, it's been a while, and this may not be, we may not find answers there either, but does anyone remember under CLCPA, whether we were trying to prioritize burdens versus vulnerabilities, or was that never made clear? Again, I'm just trying to figure out if there are additional, ways that that can help guide us to make a decision so that it's less subjective. But was there any sort of mandate or guidance, whether we're trying to reduce burdens or vulnerabilities? I'm just and we may not have, but I'm just wondering.
In the CLCPA legislation, it does not make a case for one over the other. It lists both. And through our deliberations and discussions, we kind of had those talks. And so let me see whether I can find where we go. So we talked through kind of how the legislation asked for and called out these various different components here. So these different factors within this larger vulnerabilities and burdens area. And so this was kind of the end run decision to say, well, these are balanced then, because they're called out. But, I think that sans the guidance in the actual law, there was a lot of discussion about how to balance this. And one thing I called out pretty early on is that when you all did the ground truthing, almost every single time you described a DAC, you described the socioeconomic circumstances over and above the environmental ones. And I think that that's because they're visually present. So I think that it's going to be interesting, like that they're visible, they're present, and it's harder to talk through, well, this is, in 50 years going to be a huge flood zone. And so therefore it needs also some attention and could be a disadvantaged community. I'm not sure if that helps. I do remember many conversations of talking about the intersection between those two. So the environmental burdens and the socioeconomic vulnerabilities of different regions.
Hi, it's Jill. I'm wondering if now that we have a quorum, we can go back to Abby's question to Chris about his thoughts on this.
I was
Thanks.
just gonna cue that one up. So Chris, do you remember the question? Abby, if you want to redo it, that's good too.
I think the question was, what was my thought on condensing the number of census tracts that would be considered DACs as it relates to investments, right, Abby? That was the question?
Program implementation, kind of broadly speaking, what do you, in your view, would work better?
Well, yeah, and that's, my thought was mainly that it really kind of would regardless of how many census tracts are, counted as, disadvantaged communities, agencies or administrators are still gonna have to think about, like, how are they orienting their programs to meet, to drive investments within those communities. So, I think it's really just a question of, program or initiative design that agencies are gonna have to consider. I also, think that, and I mentioned it previously, I think the other thing to keep in mind is just, the question of, how do we, ensure agencies are kind of like thinking about DACs when it comes to section 7.3. So like the regulatory process. So like if we shrink the number of communities that are, focused or targeted as DACs, then potentially fewer communities are part of that consideration process. But I know this question has really been about investments all along, right? So that's my thought.
Thank you, Chris. And I think the regulatory piece actually, which I had not been thinking about initially, is really important from my point of view. And I wonder, now that we have a quorum, can we make like a decision on this? Because at this point, I think I have strong feelings about it. I sense that others probably do too. And are we at that point?
I'm gonna stop sharing so everyone can look at each other. I feel like you guys all have opinions, and I know that it's worthwhile having this deliberative conversation if we can have it.
I put it in the chat, but I'm going to say it. Folks, now that we do have a quorum, for folks who are participating virtually, I'm gonna need you guys to be on camera. So I need you to turn your cameras on, especially if we're going to be deliberating. Thank you.
So
I'm gonna try, but I am in a dark place in multiple senses of the word. So I'm gonna give it a shot. There we go. Sorry, keep going.
Sonal, I'm going to start with you. This was something that from the comments and we discussed and brought up last time, and something that I wanted to hear your opinion on and thinking on based on kind of your request to search through this and the comments request. Any thoughts on what you think is the way to go here?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm seeing the map change in a way that's not preferable for a lot of folks for different reasons. I'm leaning towards, getting rid of the individual criteria doesn't make sense in my opinion. I think it's serving a pretty important purpose overall. I was interested to see if we just narrowed it, what would happen. It seems like it's still bringing up some issues for folks. And I think one thing I noted was it did take out other parts of Queens, which I know I've heard a lot of comments from people about Queens. And so I'm trying to be sensitive to that being a bit of a missing piece for folks in New York City. So I think that's where I'm leaning. I'm still interested to mess with the weights a little bit more and maybe go back to the geographic side of the map and think about what can we do there. So that's my next curiosity.
Yep, which is kind of where we'll go next.
Yeah.
One thing though is that for all of these, and I do want to say I want to go back to the map and show Mohawk Valley because I think someone had said that in comments and I'd missed it. So I'll do that in a second. But when I show you these maps, I want to mess with one thing at a time. And yeah, we can mess with all of them eventually, but so I want to hold to 35% now because that's what the draft criteria had. And so when we start messing with other individual criteria and factor weights, then we can come back after the fact if we want to. But if we start playing with too many things, your brain is gonna explode into the exponential changes that you could make. And so I'm going to restrict it that way. But let me come back to sharing. So, and I can show Mohawk Valley. And then we're going to kind of continue this conversation. Okay, let's see here. not Monroe. Am I getting this region right?
I would just search for Utica.
Okay, Utica, that will work. Okay, now I'm going to zoom out. There's Utica. And so we've got within Utica, everything within that, say, verse 35 versus 30 would be designated no matter what. Over here in the German Flats area, you've got 2 census tracts that would be excluded if you narrowed things down. I'm going to move this a little bit so you can see a little bit more. Any other thoughts here? Okay, I'm going to stop sharing again. I want to see everyone. For the purposes of right now, are there any other thoughts about 35 to 25%, 30%? I would like to hear them now. We can come back to this, but I just want to make sure that we're talking through some decisions now as we have a quorum.
This is Jill. The North Country is interesting because, as you said, Alex, proportionally everybody is affected basically the same. But when we only have 17 municipalities or a handful of census tracts, half of those are most of our like major population centers. So I'm reluctant to knock it down to 25. The other thing that I'm concerned about is a lot of programs across the state are based in municipalities, and it's already slightly problematic that this is based on census tracts because that complicates our municipal work. And if we knock it down and then depend on the individual criteria, I think that will limit or complicate or both the impactfulness of some of our community's programs. So I'm leaning towards kind of what we've decided on for the draft criteria with the 35%.
Sounds good.
This is Abby. Real briefly, me too. I think the sticking with our kind of no DAC left behind approach makes sense.
Yeah,
Chris, is that you back there?
Yeah, it's Chris in the back. Yep. So the other thing that, and I think we talked about this at a couple of other meetings, but I feel like there's some, incomplete kind of parts of our kind of thinking at this point. Like we don't necessarily know where a lot of these like investments are happening right now outside of, a few agencies, right? So part of me also, just feels like the more that we're able to kind of better see kind of like where things are actually happening and occurring in terms of investments in communities, that will provide the worker, more kind of insight and, better position, decisions, when the criteria is reviewed, right? So I think that's important.
Yeah. I wholeheartedly agree with that in the sense that we're dealing with the theoretical and also making these judgment calls, right? But we're doing it with incomplete data. We have the best case data that we have now. We've taken all these indicators, we've done all this stuff, we've ground truthed it. But the reality is that at this point, it's still not, it hasn't been implemented, and then therefore we cannot actually see how it's performing. And so I think it's important for us to keep that in mind and also set in some kind of vision for making sure that those data or that information, are provided to you in the future as you go through to make sure that you can see how it's performing and then make more deliberative choices later next year, the year after that. My sense is you don't want to make huge, changes to the DAC criteria too often, but that once you have some data about how these different programs are performing, it will give you a lot more information to make some of these critical decisions. Anybody else have any thoughts on this 35% versus not versus less? Or if not, I'm going to move on to the next thing we're going to do.
Hey, Alex, it's Eddie. Just out of curiosity, earlier on, I thought you mentioned that you showed us a slide that talked about the DAX we would lose at 35%, but that we didn't have for New York City, but we didn't have that for 25%. Am I conflating things, or is that accurate?
It's if you had 35%, you wouldn't lose any DAX. If you had 25%,
Oh.
you would lose some. Yeah.
Okay.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen again, and then we're gonna move on from this. Tentatively, speak up if not, we're gonna move with the idea that 35% is what we're gonna use as our base right now, and then we can come back to that and revisit it as we tinker more. Okay, again, sharing my whole screen so I won't see all you all. And let me get out of this and move on to the next question that we have at hand. So the next one is these component scores and how do we combine them? And I'm just going to skip to this and kind of talk through this. We have burden scores, we have vulnerability scores. These are the larger scores where all the indicators that get added into factors that then get added into these giant kind of burdens or vulnerability scores. Currently, the process we're using is the one down here where we take the burden score and we multiply it by the vulnerability score. The idea behind that, aside from this precedent having been set by other regions that have done this before, is the idea within kind of the EJ community that the burdens and vulnerabilities exacerbate one another. So they multiply the effects of one another. And so this allows you to do that. It can make, if you have a high vulnerability and a high burden, it shows how impacted you can be, as opposed to some places where they have, say, a high vulnerability but very low burden score, they may not overall, be as impacted. Now, one of the things about this, though, is that when we're looking at different geographic areas and we're describing things, a lot of people in the comments and also you all have expressed the idea that the vulnerabilities and Sonal, to your point last meeting, the kind of ability to have resilience, those indicators, those data points really lie within the vulnerability side of things. So how do we make that a bigger part of the equation? And to do that, we just have to change the math. So rather than multiplying these, then we would add them. And then at that point, then you can make basically like the piece of the pie, the formula, you can make vulnerabilities have more impact than burdens. Does that make sense to you all?
Hey, Alex, it might, but I'm curious. Why would we want to rank vulnerability? Why would we want a formula that would advantage communities with higher vulnerabilities versus the multiply? I'm just trying to follow that part of it.
Yeah, so this was based on the comments and also some just discussion generally about where you all kind of in ground truthing and where you feel the DAX most kind of viscerally, they're the ones that have higher scores and vulnerabilities, but slightly less burden scores.
Yeah,
And
that to me sounds counterintuitive because when we were working on the legislation, I think one of the reasons we talked about burdens and vulnerabilities equally is because it was important to us to go after the burdens, which by and large tend to capture more of the demographics that people had in mind when we were first writing this legislation. So, because for example, when I hear giving somehow advantaging communities with higher vulnerabilities, that feels to me like higher income communities can still be more vulnerable. but not have burdens. So to me, it sounds counterintuitive. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think you're skipping these terms, I gotta tell you, really get to me because they're they're hard. The vulnerabilities are the parts where you're thinking of, and let me go back to here. The vulnerabilities are the income, race, ethnicity, health impacts, burdens, housing, and energy and communications. The burdens are the environmental burdens, those that have higher exposure to pollution, land use and discrimination and disinvestment, and then potential climate change risks. And in preparation for today, I went and started looking at, well, how do these relate to these? So if you think of these different square blocks underneath the burden, so how do these kind of orangey brown things here relate statistically to these blue boxes here? And so bear with me, I'm going to show you statistics, but I want you to bear with me on this. One of the things that I wanted to show here was something that I think is going to be kind of crazy. If you look at these are the reddish, so I'm just going to go with kind of like this orange look to it. These right here are the burdens, and we're going to compare them to the vulnerabilities, so these right here. And I want you to take a look and see how things are correlated. Correlation is an interesting thing. So basically what I'm doing is I'm taking the numbers associated with, say, the climate change risk
All right, Alex,
factor. Yep.
Alex, can you make it bigger?
Yes, yes.
These are super small. I'm sitting close to the screen, but yeah.
Yeah, let me just
Thank
take
you.
this out and then I'm going to try to make this a little bit easier for you to even see because it's kind of crazy. Okay. I'm going to take you back to Stats 101 on this. And the idea here is that if you're looking at these scores, the most important thing you want to think about is bigger scores mean higher correlation or relationship. So income really, 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 really correlates with the housing, mobility, and communications factor. So that's good. That makes sense. The health also correlates with income. But now if you're taking a look at the environmental components here, these burdens, the environmental burdens, how do those relate to the factor scores that are about vulnerability? And there's not a lot of correlation here. There's a little bit. What I think is interesting is the climate change risk one is negatively correlated. That means that there's kind of this negative association. The people who score really high in climate change risks score low in race, ethnicity, income, housing and mobility, health, and then they score relatively lower on other components too, like the environmental exposures. What this tells me is that this is neither good nor bad, but this factor, burden of the climate change risks, captures something that other things are not capturing. It is capturing potentially, we talked about the Hamptons, right? There's a huge climate change risk to people in certain areas that may not be vulnerable in other places, like income or race. So when I think
So
about
Alex,
this,
so quick question. So what you're showing, I think, confirms what I just said a few minutes ago. Does it not? Which is that the higher vulnerability, by vulnerability, I mean climate change risk specifically. That was the context I meant it in. So if we looked at that and compared it to burdens captures more of what's traditionally understood demographically as disadvantaged communities, correct?
you're flipping it actually. So vulnerabilities in
Okay.
this case are the demographics, the sociodemographic components. Burden are the environmental burdens.
Right. No, I'm talking about in this particular, like when you're comparing climate change risks to environmental exposures, that's
Mm-hmm.
the comparison I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the big picture
Oh
vulnerabilities
yeah, yeah,
versus
yeah.
burdens. Like in just those two rows, climate
Mm-hmm.
change risks captures more people than but then not more people. Let me rephrase. The climate change risks capture populations that don't necessarily have disproportionate environmental burdens, right?
They don't necessarily have disproportionate environmental burdens.
Right.
They also don't these guys also tend to not have less health vulnerabilities,
Right.
less housing vulnerabilities, less income vulnerability, and less race and ethnicity vulnerabilities. So in this case, often I like to think of these as these are probably more well-off
Right.
people, but they're still very environmentally, like with climate change,
Right.
burdened.
And the reason why it's important is that I'm just trying to share some of the thinking that went into the legislation, and the lawyers on the call. That's what you call a legislative intent, I imagine. But that's exactly right. Like, this is what's been bothering me this whole time, which is those numbers or those DACs that somehow seem off, that somehow seem. I think the reason is this exact juxtaposition. I think that um, the whole point of CLCPA in this part of the law was to try to drive resources to communities that, are have been historically disadvantaged, but also at present, not like we said, everybody's got climate change risks, but because of the environmental burdens, disproportionate burdens, the climate change risks that people have that extra layer on top of it, which is, for example, if there's a storm surge, the dislodging of chemicals if you live in or near an industrial area, right? That's not something the Hamptons needs to worry about. So that's what I'm trying to say is that the thinking was all along, can we get to those communities? It's like that old saying, right? Climate change affects everyone, but its impacts will not be evenly felt. And this is exactly what we were looking to avoid, which is to drive resources to communities that, albeit are have high vulnerability risks, have other criteria and other options, have other, they're not as and I think the part of the problem is the use of the word vulnerable, right? But I think that's anyway, let me stop there, but I think this is really illuminating. That, no pun intended, with your company. Thank you.
Yeah, no, to me, this was, I thought, really interesting to look at when you start thinking about that burden score. What is that telling us about this particular factor within that? And so then I started tinkering, and I started tinkering in this way. So let me put this up here, and you can start seeing a couple things. One is everything's the same right now. So everything's red, there's no change. Over here, I have the scenario 1 factors over here. So we're kind of, because we're talking now, and I want to take a departure here of, we're not talking about the multiplication addition thing right now. We're actually talking about like changing factor weights. So we're going to skip ahead, but this is where the conversation is going. So let's just do it. Scenario 1, these are the weights that we have for each of those factors, right? So I've got income, race, ethnicity, health, housing, and then those are in the vulnerability component score. And then you've got the environmental exposures, land use, and climate change risks. Those are in the burden ones. So right now they're all the same, but what if we take this and put this into as a 1? What would happen? Come on, what would happen? It's going to very slowly think for us. Haha! Okay, things change. I want to, stop doing that. Okay. Apologies, this seems to just want to make me do that weird thing. So let me go back out here and then put this back here. Okay, I've now changed this down here from a 2 to a 1 in scenario 2. If we look here at the proportions breakdowns, there's going to be some changes and shifts within New York City, but the proportions are the same. Fewer DACs are now in Mid-Hudson region, more in Western New York. Basically the same in the Finger Lakes, slightly less in Central New York. Long Island is the same proportionally. There's definitely one less. Capital Region has a couple increased. Southern Tier increase, and then Mohawk Valley 1%, so 2 DACs there. North Country loses 2. Now let's look at the map a little bit. Now in this case, I'm just going to zoom into New York City because this is kind of interesting. Even though the proportions are there, things change. In scenario 2, which is the one that minimizes that climate factor, some new things pop up and you lose other ones in the yellow. So if we look here, there's been some discussion about Queens. You would lose a DAC if you kind of take out the climate risk part. You would lose a DAC in some parts here, but you would gain others up in this area. So blue in scenario 2 means it would only pop up if that climate change factor were reduced a little bit. Yellow would only show up if that climate change factor stayed at what they were before. And red is that they would not change at all.
Jill, I have a question.
Yeah.
You said that the North Country would only lose 2% or 2
No,
DACs?
2 DACs. So if you look at North Country, here we go. Oh, 4. So
I
it
see
loses.
at least 5.
Okay, so we've got, let's see here. Got 1, 2, 3, 4. And then I wonder whether, is this not considered North Country? Okay.
And Jefferson County is, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't know where the math is wrong here. But I count 5 too.
Okay.
There is actually, here's the difference. This one right here, this little tiny blue one gets added. So you lose these 5, but you gain this 1.
Okay.
Hey, Alex and team, is it possible that any of those North Country census tracts in yellow would be added back in with native land adding?
I
Do we
don't
not
think
know that?
so. No, I don't think any of
Akwesasne
these would. Yeah.
Yeah, it's Akwesasne's west or east of like Cornwall on the map, and I don't see that.
Yeah. So this is, I find very interesting to see, okay, well, if we're changing this one component, let's see what else happens in different places. What this does to me is show, you know, let's actually go to the place we've all been talking about. Let's go to Long Island and see what we see. Okay. So in this case, you would lose West Hampton Beach Village. You would lose Shirley CDP, a couple here and here. But also going more inner city part of Long Island or closer to the city, you would gain a couple as well. So there's a shift, and in some ways you can kind of see this where some of the coastal kind of components for flooding, I think, would come in and you would lose some of these, but you would gain some other areas that have a less of a burden than the ones that were kind of coming through here. This is a good example of one. Right here, Oceanside, you would
So
lose
Alex,
this if you
this is
minimize
Abby.
climate.
Yep. I and now the meeting's being recorded.
What's that?
Is Abby muted? I can't hear her.
Yeah, Abby, we lost you.
That was weird. Okay, sorry. So this approach kind of, sorry, I don't know why I'm having so much trouble like putting this into words, but by lessening how much we're waiting, I guess, right? This is about waiting. Is that correct?
This is about waiting. Yep.
So we are now weighting climate risk is what this one is called, right? It's not called vulnerability, it's called risk. But it's in the burden bucket.
It is in the burden bucket.
The words and actually, well, let me
I
go back
know.
a second. On that other slide where you have like the two blocks, if you would at some point, yeah, so this is the good one because it spells out the whole thing, environmental burdens and climate change risks, which is like, okay, population characteristics and health vulnerabilities. If at some point you can put that entire language into the other one where it just has, I think
The
that would be
simple
helpful
blocks.
for us
Yeah.
to look at it. But that's a bit of an aside. So this difference in weighting approach, I guess what I'm really interested in, how does this compare with the adding versus multiplying approach? And I have a feeling that we're going to need to probably all have some time to like look at the maps and compare and contrast. Is that going to be an opportunity?
It is. And
Okay.
and we're building out one where you can do all the things.
Mhm.
And it honestly kind of will blow your mind in a little bit because there's so many different levers you can pull on it to mess with this. So let me show you what I mean by that. Okay. This one I don't know if you've noticed, but I've actually have 3 different Tableau documents up because the complexity of what we're trying to talk through and do right now is so complex that it I didn't want to risk blowing everything up by changing this. So one of the things here that I would say is this one lets you add versus multiply. So I have this little drop down. Shout out to my team who figured out how to do that. It was not easy. But we then reworked the thresholds to make it so it was 35% to 35% here. And there are some differences in the map here if we do this, and I haven't even changed that climate one yet, right? So this is kind of going into different territory than what we've talked about so far. And I'm going to show you this. And it doesn't look pretty. Why doesn't it look pretty? But one of the things that we're getting into, this is always complex. This is always really hard to talk through, but we're talking about so many little technical changes that it's just hard to grok sometimes all of the little changes and what it's going to actually mean. In this case, if I'm adding versus multiplying the different components, certain things are not exacerbated as much, right? So you don't have the extremes really popping to the extreme. You're just adding them together. And so it does change the equation quite a lot. So let me show you that. And then we'll go back to the component scores. And also, if there's chat, I can't see it. I know that I saw something pop up, but I can't read it. So if you move to addition versus multiplication, you see the differences here. There's some additional there's some additional census tracts that are designated a DAC that are blue. And then you lose some others in Queens. And then you're kind of getting the same thing. So even if there's some changes here, there's a market increase in Mohawk Valley, there's an increase in Southern Tier, and then you're kind of losing some in some of the more populated areas.
Alex, can you zoom out just a little bit for the New York City slide?
Zoom out? Yep.
Too far. Sorry. Between those two, sorry.
Yeah, let me see if I can do it. Let's see. I'm
Yeah.
gonna zoom out again and
No,
kind of.
you had it. That was great. Sorry.
Okay, I'm gonna redo it. Let's see. Does that work?
Yeah, and explain one more time what the blue versus the yellow. What's happening here?
Yeah.
This is much better for me. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. And and keep in mind, so we've kind of gone back, the climate change factor now, still it's the same. Everything is the same except for when we added versus subtracted. So we're kind of flopping back. Again, just trying to keep one thing the same or one thing different in this case. So what you see with the blue is if we added the two component scores, the burden and the vulnerability scores, and then did the rank and the threshold and did all that thing. If we added them together, the blue and the red would be designated DACs. If we multiplied instead, like we have done in the past, the red and the yellow would be designated the DACs. So the differences are the blue and the yellow. And this is what I mean so much about this is a judgment call about what we're doing and what feels right to you all in various places.
Alex, is there anything you can tell us about kind of, I guess, overarching trends of what I'm guessing you've probably looked at this in a little more detail and have a sense of what we are or are not getting with one versus the other of these approaches.
Yeah, I would say that this increases the weight of the vulnerabilities a little bit more in the sense of it allows for, well, here you've got some other kind of different areas. It allows for kind of a different perspective in that, let's just look at a couple that are, I'm going to zoom in here and do this because I think the case study approach is the easiest way of describing what's going on here. This is a DAC no matter what. It's got 60th percentile burden and 77th percentile vulnerability. Right next to it, this would only be a DAC if you added the two component scores together. It's got a 44th percentile burden and a 77th percentile vulnerability. So 60th, so there's, you know, some changes here, right? And then now let's look over here. When you look at this one, this would only be designated a DAC if you multiplied the component scores together. This is 62nd percentile for burden, 71st percentile for vulnerability. This one is a DAC no matter what. So you're talking about tiny changes, but yet they actually still matter, right? Like, why is this not a DAC, but this one is? Well, in this case, the red line score is 3.7. This one is 4.0, but the burdens and the percentiles are different. So in this case, the vulnerability percentile is 83. And when you add them together, this would become a DAC. So let me try to find one that has all three right next to each other. Here we go. This would be a DAC if you multiplied things together. And you look here, the median income is 78,000. Percent less, population with less than 80% AMI, 69%. If you go over here, this would be a DAC only if you added the component scores together. The median income is 51. The 65% less than AMI. So it's not like huge, right? The median income is lower in this case. The vulnerability percentile down here is 79%, and the burden percentile is 40%. In this case, you've got a larger burden percentile and a smaller vulnerability percentile. Higher income, still largely a Black African American census tract. This even more so, lower income, but less environmental burdens. And surrounding it, no matter what you get, are DACs. So this is kind of the story each time. If you're if you're multiplying things together, then the burden percentile and the vulnerability percentile, even if they're not like, you know, dramatically large, if they're both high, like 66th percentile or 68th percentile, they're gonna multiply.
Ask a question?
Yep.
So this data is going to be updated annually, or how often?
That depends on the different indicators and data that we have. So there are some things that are census based that we're not going to update annually. There are some different components, like say infant mortality rates, that might even be less often updated, but some more often updated. We actually have a list that we're going to present to you at some point.
Hey,
Okay,
Alex, it's
because
Lana.
I think that, especially in Brooklyn, like I've grown up there all my life, and we kind of mentioned something about gentrification as well. You know, it's a changing borough. Like you were in East Flatbush before and we were losing or gaining some certain things. So I think this is even going to change as we update the data and where folks move. So, I mean, I know it's hard for me to get my head around, but I think at least like in my experience, like there, things are changing and they're going to continue to change. So as we update, you know, like East Flatbush is going to change and all that. So that's something to consider as well.
I will say that the census data only is updated every 10 years though, right? So I think as far as like capturing who is moving and like sort of the nuance of that, I'm not sure how often we'll be able to capture that in the annual reviews. Is that?
Well,
No,
the
the census data, the American Community Survey is pulling
Every 2
in
years?
a lot of the data here. So that's every year they do it. We're using 5-year estimates because those are statistically way more viable and less variable. And so we'll update them, but they're not going to be as movable as you think. They're relatively stable.
Yeah, I think, yeah, the data is going to shift around and also, you know, the issue with census tracts, you're not capturing everybody within this piece or that piece. At least speaking about Brooklyn and the kind of denseness of New York City, it's going to be a moving target. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure that like mincing it so much. I think the iterative process of updating the data will be more useful. But so the community survey, the health indicators, the health indicators will be updated how often? Or is that a part of that survey?
No, there are some infant mortality, other things that we actually get from agency data. And so those are going to take longer. So what I need to do is come back to you with like the list and take a look. And then also we need to make some judgment calls. And I think that the agencies need to really weigh in and give some perspective here because it's going to be a lot to update this annually. And I think that what's going to happen is that there might be some rolling updates as it goes. But then there's some decisions about how often do you want to change this? Because enacting change in a community takes time. And if little things are popping in and out, because that's how data works, it's an imperfect tool for the realities of this, you know? And so I would caution from changing things so much too often, but then also wanting to keep it as refreshed as possible.
Yeah, I'm very new to this, so I'm not proposing changing everything this late in the game, but it was more a question of how often it changes.
No,
Yeah.
I got that. And so what I want to do is like think carefully about how often we do change that and refresh the data. Because we now have access to 2020 census data, we have been using the 2010 census block data. And we had been wanting to study the response bias for the 2020 census before we kind of embraced all of that. We're going to have to go through it with it, but that might be another year down the road. So let me get a list and work with the agencies to kind of come up with an idea of recommendation on that, because it's a big question and a really important one for the future of this.
Yeah, I mean, the 2020 versus 2010 census is a whole other can of worms.
Right? It just keeps adding up and up.
Yeah.
I do want to say this, and I think your point is a good one here. I hate to make this allusion to this, but it's almost like an impressionist painting when you're looking at this. Like we're making changes here that, yes, there's certain census tracts that pop in and out in these various ways. Again, it's a judgment call at this point. You're kind of have to squint your eyes and be like, well, this is clearly a highly impacted area. There are a lot of census tracts in this region. There are a lot of communities in here. one choice may shift things a little bit one way or the other, but is that a meaningful shift? With the data, it's kind of just is, with the thresholds the way they are. So we have to start making choices, you know, and see where they go, and continue, I think, these conversations with the data about, you know, how these stacks are functioning as they go.
Thank you.
Alex, can we take a quick look at Long Island? I wanted to just get my eyes on City Island and Brookhaven.
Yep, let's see what we can do here. So
Thanks.
Brookhaven, if we go here, we're looking at the addition, because addition, again, this point, so this is a pretty high vulnerability, but low burden percentile. Community gets added if you're adding, is included in this case, but nothing is excluded.
Okay,
And then until you get over here.
right. If that was a concern.
Yeah. So there are so many things, and at this point, you know, we're adding things we can start changing, and I'm gonna really break your brain on this one, and I apologize, but I don't, because this is where we need to go with it. If we minimize that component score, that climate change component score, please tell me I didn't really hurt everything now. Now we have two changes that we've made. Okay, now we've shifted things again a little bit. So let me kind of come back here to look at what's happened. We have now changed things so that we're in scenario 2 adding the component scores together, and we have taken the weight for that climate risk component or the factor under the burden component and reduced it. We're now have about the same amount of DACs in New York City. I'm sure there's differences of which ones are which, but there's a loss in Mid-Hudson, a gain in Western New York. Finger Lake's about the same. Central New York loses a few. Long Island gains a couple. Capital Region the same. Southern Tier increases quite a bit. Mohawk Valley increases. North Country has a net loss of 2. So let's look around and see what we see. Anyone want to tell me where to go first? Okay, let's see. We haven't been to Buffalo yet. We're going to Buffalo. Rava, are you here? Rava might not be here, so this might not be as helpful. But you can see that there are some additions in Buffalo in surrounding areas. There's 2 losses really in there, and then Niagara Falls, you lose 1. And now I'm going to go up to North Country, net gain here, so, or net loss of 2 in North Country, 1 gain here. You're losing these as before, and I bet you there's 1 in here that you're gaining.
Maybe if we could look at the Mid-Hudson sort of area where I'm seeing a lot of yellow in there.
Let's see. Am I getting it right?
Yep, you're getting it.
So one of the things that you'll note here, and this is anytime you're minimizing any of the climate change kind of components, the riverine flooding weighs heavily on this area, and so you're losing things around the river and gaining a few in other areas.
This is Abby. I have a question for my fellow working group members. You know, recognizing that this isn't going to be perfect and there's going to be a lag with the data and all of that. Seems like philosophically we need to know what the decision is based on. And in my brain, I keep coming back to what Sonal said last meeting about resilience. being a priority and to make sure our DACs reflect communities that will struggle to bounce back when climate impacts, occur. Is that something that we are like kind of, is there consensus around that or not? Just curious.
Hey, it's a direct response. It's hard to quantify. Like, what is resilience, and what's resilience for one DAC versus another? Like, and resilience itself has become a term that some folks in the movement have issues with because of that exact. There's no real way to quantify what is a resilient versus. So I don't know. And to be candid, as I'm sitting through this, what it's feeling like to me is marginal differences. It's just feeling like we're picking this DAC and not that DAC. And to me, that well, with all due respect to the folks in the DACs that get selected or not, it's totally important to them. But for me, I'm trying to look at this systemically. I'm trying to look at this in terms of what's the biggest bang for the buck, and what are the communities we intended to try to drive these resources to. And I mean, it's been interesting to watch, but I'm not finding the multiplication versus adding, or like or moving the climate risk from one category to another. I'm not seeing it make more than marginal changes, and it almost feels to me like, what's the point if that's it? Because what we've put out publicly, and that's what the public has commented on, it feels a little weird if we start making changes that doesn't really have an overall impact. And we're right back. It feels like six of one and half dozen of the other, if that makes us out there. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where I started with this, is that we're functioning with as much data as we have in information, and these are our judgment calls at this point. Sonal, you have your hand up.
Yeah, and I appreciate Abby bringing up what I had said before. And I think, I mean, when I'm thinking about the map, that's what I'm thinking about. I think to Eddie's point, the disclaimer is that, and one of the main issues people have with the term resiliency is that like people shouldn't have to be resilient. And where does resiliency come from? It comes from hardship. It comes from, a lifetime of non-investment. It comes from having to deal with multiple hardships at one time, all of that. And so I do think that it's the way that I'm looking at the map in terms of like, well, who's needing to rebuild more and who's not, and who can rebuild and who has a harder time and has to be more resilient. So I think that's just my clarification of the term, but I still agree with Abby at the core of it is like that's the way I'm thinking about it, and I think that's leading me to be more interested, which I don't think we've done yet, unless I'm confused, is like weight the vulnerability items together and see what that looks like, because I think that's more getting at those like quote unquote resiliency characteristics.
Yeah. Abby,
Can I chime in with one thing? Just what I guess also kind of is sticking with me right now is, Alex, when you had those, couple right next to each other and looking at, just, what you can tell from the numbers, it definitely, with those two sitting right next to each other, looked pretty clear to me that the one that was blue, I think it was blue, was going to be able to rebuild or not going to be able to rebuild in the way that the yellow one right next door would. So, I mean, I don't know if that pattern holds across the state, but it does seem like if that pattern holds across the state, that there's something there.
so we have 15 minutes left, and so what I'm hearing, a couple things. One is these are changes around the edges, right? And so it is hard because it's really they're small, but they're also meaningful. This is important work. So this is what makes this hard. But what I'm hearing again is like the ability to bounce back, the ability to handle or weather these changes is kind of the perspective that you all want to take. And then from that, what I need to do is, given all the things that I've given you, I want to do some numbers to try to see for the census tracts that are in, say, scenario 2 versus scenario 1, like what does that look like demographic wise and other things. So kind of generally speaking, let's look at what the differences are there. And I will say this, there's a lot of regression to the mean in the sense of like, once you get to this kind of like looking across the whole state, you're not seeing the granular differences as to that case study approach. So I'm going to have to do some tinkering on how to make that meaningful. And it might be a regional divide and then looking at the demographics and the burdens and things like that. So let me look at that. So
Alex, while you're doing that, one last thing. So I think that, and not to belabor the point, but the issue of resiliency, again, even that definition, there's not in the movement, there's not a uniform acceptance of what, like, for example, what resiliency often means is bouncing back, right? But from an environmental and climate justice perspective, what we've been saying now for years is that bouncing back is not enough. To bounce back to an inequitable system, we want to need to do better than that. So that's why I struggle with the resiliency phrase, and not to steal from the president, but build back better. That is the concept of that, at least that framing is what I think resiliency means to EJ and CJ communities. Now, what does that mean in terms of the application here? I don't think we can get to that. That's more of an aspirational goal. But please, that's why I was trying to say, like, resiliency as a phrase is complicated and even a touch controversial, because what are we bouncing back to? So anyway, let's keep going. Sorry.
yeah, no, well, let's do the physics lesson of like bouncing back, but higher. Horrible at metaphors this late in the game on this one. Okay, so I have a list of things that I need to do for the next meeting, but we have kind of actually made a few decisions throughout this, and one is that we're gonna keep más o menos to 35% for now, because it feels like that is what feels right as far as the combination, and in also including individual criteria to that. My list is telling me that I need to look at these different scenarios I've shown you. This is like the crazy add versus multiply, the climate component being minimized in its weight, and then the kind of combination of the two. And I need to look at the demographics and see whether there's differences in the scenarios and show you that for those different ones. So giving you kind of the average scores for vulnerability and burdens, those things. So I will have that prep for you next time. I do want to give 10 minutes to Alana to talk through timeline and some decisions that we need to make as far as when are we going to vote on this. But I will leave you with this, that you're right, these are just decisions around the edges, but they're still hard because it matters. We also are functioning, frankly, on just theoretical data at this point, right? And so we're doing our best to make the decisions for this first year, knowing that in the future we're going to have to adapt this. And so the other part of this is that I want to work with the agencies to come up with a plan for the refresh and that kind of component, so that the data refreshes and things. Alana, handing it back to you.
Thanks, Alex. So I wanted to take these last few minutes of the meeting just to talk about the work plan again. I said that I would bring this up periodically, and so I'm doing it again. Now that we've had that, and I thought really excellent conversation, got to make some decisions, and we also, I think, are mentally kind of considering what our quote unquote finalized decision is going to look like. I wanted to discuss how we feel about the timeline. Right now, tentatively, it's looking like we're going to vote on February 23rd. And I guess my question is, do we still feel that that is an appropriate date for us to finalize this criteria? Or do we need to maybe take another meeting, take another beat? You know, I'm not talking about extending this out for forever. I'm talking about maybe adding an additional meeting in there, and maybe make this decision in the beginning or in mid-March, rather than end of February, just if, you know, I'm just trying to fill that out for folks. Eddie, your hand is up.
Yeah, thanks, Alana. I just to refresh. So is the 23rd our next and last meeting, or do we have one in between?
We have one in between. We have the 16th, and then the 23rd would be that. So I'm wondering if we need at least one more just to kind of, you know, sit with this, talk back and forth a little bit more, or are we all still comfortable with the 23rd being that date?
since since I asked the question, let me just, from my perspective, if we have one more meeting before we vote, I don't know if we gain much more other than more confusion and brain exploding. So I'm fine if we continue at the pace we're going, voting on the 23rd, but love to hear what others think.
This is Jill. I agree with Eddie.
This is Abby. I also agree with Eddie, though I would like to give Alex the opportunity to say, gosh, I could really use another 2 weeks if she thinks that she needs it.
I
hope to
guess
get it done.
as a newer member, what do we have to accomplish? Like, what do we have to do before the vote? And I guess that also goes to what Abby was saying. Like, if Alex needs more time.
Yeah, to that point, I'll answer. I don't think I need more time. I need to get these data to us. What I need from you all is to make sure that we have quorum next meeting so that we can really make some decisions, because what I would like to do is come into the 23rd with one or max two scenarios that we have agreed upon and talked about so that we can move forward from that and have a vote. Sonal, I see your hand up.
Yeah, process question. I definitively won't be in person on the 23rd. What does that mean for my vote?
So as long as we have a physical quorum, so we have at least 7 of us in physical, publicly accessible locations, we will be able to go to a vote, and folks who do vote virtually will have their votes counted, obviously. But if we don't have a quorum, then we cannot vote. Does anybody else want to weigh in? I will ask one more time on the 16th, just to double check and make sure. But it's looking like folks are still comfortable with the 23rd, which is fine. So we'll continue on with our timeline as is planned. Just letting everyone know that if at any point you do feel uncomfortable with it, feel free. It can be adjusted. I know that we do want to get this done. We've been together so long, and I know that we definitely want to make this decision, make it legal, you know? So I guess, so I will bring it up again, just to, test everybody's comfort levels, make sure that, we're not, and nobody feels rushed or pushed into anything. But we'll move forward with the 23rd being the voting date. Thanks, folks, for that. Before we go, I do want to talk quickly, if someone can move to the next slide. Just a quick reminder, for Climate Justice Working Group members, you should have received a meeting invitation. Remember, you guys are all eligible with regards to the air monitoring to receive an Aklama Pro license. Just look at the preliminary data from our community air monitoring initiative. So to begin the onboarding process, we just, obviously we needed the email addresses of folks who are, I see a hand up.
Sorry, Lonnie, finish your thought, but it's about this. Keep going. I'm sorry.
Okay, yep. So there is a training session that's been scheduled for Wednesday, the 22nd, from 3 to 4:15. If you can't make it, we are going to be scheduling more training opportunities in the future. But we are looking to onboard folks to the platform. So there might be non-climate justice working group members that will join in these trainings as well. So and this is also for folks, if you're not interested in accessing the air monitoring data, just let me know so we can look to get as many community-based organizations free access as possible. So if you know for a fact right now that you're not going to be accessing the data, let us know so we can let somebody else use that membership or that data. Eddie?
Thanks, Lon. I think you answered it. I just wanted to make sure that climate justice working group members, if we have staff / consultants that are point people for air monitoring, whether we could include them in the training. It sounds like you're saying yes, but I just want to just ask that flat out.
I think there's still a question about that. Let me get back to you on that. I want to make sure, I don't want to say and then find out, nope, that was completely wrong. So let me get back to you on that. I'll send around an email with that definitively. So we don't have any question as to who can and can't be on. And as I said, does anybody else have any questions regarding the Acoma Pro? Is New York City hand up? Someone have a question?
Not about this, something else.
Okay. Do you want to ask?
Oh, sure. Yes, I just didn't want, I wanted others to weigh in on the air monitoring stuff if there were more questions about that. I just wanted to give one more plug on just hearing the timeline conversation that we just had, that and hearing that Sonal definitively cannot be there in person. That not only does quorum on the 23rd matter a lot because there's a vote plan there, but that means our next meeting on the 16th is even just as critical because it's our last opportunity to deliberate. And if we don't have quorum, we can't deliberate as we saw today. So just wanted to give that last plug. Thank you.
Yep, as we remember from our meetings in December 2021, when those meetings leading up to the vote were for building consensus, and they're very critical. So if you can be in person, and this is for members who are definitely have to be virtual. If you can be in person to help out working group members who have to be virtual, please be in person. It's really, really important. Yes. Open meetings law, it's what we're living with. Last thing before we break for today, because we're right up there. As I just said, our next meetings are going to take place on February 16th and the 23rd, and that's going to be from 12 to 2. So we're just going to continue our work until then. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, etc., make sure you reach out to me, reach out to members of the technical team. We're here to bounce anything off of, or if there is anything that you missed and need additional information on, definitely let us know. And so thank you for taking time out of your schedules to do this. It's, like I said, it's very important work. We are coming to the end. And you guys really have, you stick to itness has really been very much appreciated. So I will see you on the 16th, or I'll talk to you sooner if you need to talk to me. All right. Have a good day, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Happy Valentine's Day.
Happy Valentine's Day.
You too.
Bye, everyone.